In the vastness of the ancient world, where empires rose like morning mists from the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia and the wind-swept plateaus of Central Asia, there emerged a civilization that would stretch its golden fingers across 3 continents and touch the lives of countless millions. The story begins not with the clash of bronze against bronze, nor with the thunder of cavalry charges across dusty plains, but with the quiet rustle of desert winds through the passes of the Zagros Mountains, where nomadic tribes had wandered for countless generations, their footsteps leaving no permanent mark upon the earth, their dreams as ephemeral as the shifting sands. The land that would become the heart of the greatest empire the world had yet known was harsh and unforgiving. A realm of extremes where scorching summers gave way to bitter winters, where fertile oases dotted landscapes of stone and scrub. Here, in the 7th century before the Common Era, the Persian tribes lived as their ancestors had for time immemorial, following the seasonal migrations of their flocks, living in felt tents that could be folded and carried at a moment's notice. Their gods were the ancient ones of the Indo-Iranian peoples, and their society was built upon the bedrock of honor, truth, and the warrior's code that would later echo through the marble halls of Persepolis. Among these wandering peoples, the Achaemenid clan distinguished itself not through conquest or overwhelming force, but through the subtler arts of leadership and vision. They were princes among nomads, chieftains who understood that true power lay not in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to unite, to inspire, to transform the dreams of scattered tribes into the shared destiny of a great nation. The early Achaemenid kings ruled over territories that could be crossed on horseback in a matter of days. Their wealth measured not in gold, but in horses and cattle, their palaces nothing more than the largest tent in the encampment. Yet even in these humble beginnings, there were signs of the greatness to come. The Achaemenids possessed an almost mystical ability to see beyond the immediate horizon, to envision possibilities that lay dormant in the hearts of their people. They understood that the age of the small tribe and the local chieftain was drawing to a close, that the future belonged to those who could think in terms of continents rather than valleys, of decades rather than seasons. When they looked out across the vast expanse of the known world, they saw not insurmountable obstacles, but stepping stones to glory. The transformation from nomadic chiefs to imperial dynasty began in earnest during the reign of Cyrus I, whose name would later become synonymous with wisdom and just rule throughout the ancient world. Under his guidance, the Persian tribes began their gradual settlement in the region known as Fars, a land of rugged beauty where the mountains met the plains and ancient trade routes converged like the spokes of a great wheel. Here, the Persians learned the arts of agriculture and craftsmanship, the construction of permanent settlements, and the administration of fixed territories. More importantly, they began to develop the administrative genius that would later enable them to govern an empire spanning from the Indus River to the shores of the Mediterranean. The true architect of Persian greatness, however, was Cyrus II, known to history as Cyrus the Great, whose reign marked the transformation of a regional kingdom into a world empire. Born into a world where the great powers of the age, Babylon, Lydia, Egypt, and Media, seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, Cyrus possessed the revolutionary vision to see these ancient giants as merely the first stepping stones in a greater destiny. His genius lay not in military innovation, though he was certainly a capable general, but in his profound understanding of human nature and the delicate art of governance. Where other conquerors relied upon fear and destruction to maintain their rule, Cyrus pioneered a different approach, one that would become the hallmark of Persian imperial policy for generations to come. He understood that lasting empire could not be built upon the foundation of terror alone, that true strength came from the willing submission of diverse peoples united under a common banner. This philosophy would manifest itself most famously in his treatment of conquered peoples, his respect for local customs and religious practices, and his unprecedented policy of cultural tolerance that stood in stark contrast to the brutal suppression practiced by earlier empires. The Persian expansion began with the conquest of Media in 550 BCE, a victory that was achieved as much through political maneuvering and strategic alliances as through military force. The Median Empire, which had dominated the region for over a century, fell not to a devastating assault, but to the gradual erosion of loyalty, as Persian gold and Persian promises proved more attractive than Median rule. This pattern would repeat itself across the ancient world, as Cyrus and his successors demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to turn enemies into allies, to transform conquest into liberation. With the Median territories under Persian control, Cyrus turned his attention to the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia, a land famous throughout the ancient world for its gold and its innovation in coinage. The Lydian king Croesus, whose wealth had become proverbial, represented everything that the old order of kingship embodied: vast personal wealth, autocratic rule, and the assumption that military might alone could guarantee security. The clash between Croesus and Cyrus was thus more than a simple territorial dispute. It was a confrontation between two entirely different visions of what kingship could and should be. The fall of Lydia in 546 BCE marked a turning point not just in Persian expansion, but in the very nature of imperial rule. Where Croesus had hoarded wealth and ruled through fear, Cyrus distributed riches and governed through consensus. Where the Lydian court had been marked by intrigue and suspicion, the Persian administration was characterized by meritocracy and efficiency. The Greek cities of the Ionian coast, which had chafed under Lydian rule, found themselves surprisingly well treated under their new Persian overlords, allowed to maintain their local customs and institutions while contributing to the greater glory of the growing empire. The conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE perhaps best exemplified the revolutionary nature of Cyrus's approach to empire building. The ancient city, which had stood as a symbol of power and civilization for over a millennium, surrendered without a siege, its gates thrown open by citizens who had grown weary of their unpopular king. Cyrus's subsequent actions cemented his reputation as a ruler unlike any who had come before. He restored the temples that had been neglected, returned the sacred objects that had been seized from conquered peoples, and issued what would become known as the Cyrus Cylinder, often called the world's first charter of human rights. Under Cyrus and his immediate successors, the Achaemenid Empire expanded with breathtaking speed, absorbing the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, and eventually Egypt under Cambyses II. Each conquest brought new peoples, new customs, new challenges of administration and integration. Yet the Persian genius for organization and tolerance proved equal to every challenge, creating a governmental system that was both centralized and flexible, maintaining unity while respecting diversity. The physical manifestation of this imperial glory reached its zenith under Darius I, whose reign saw the construction of the magnificent ceremonial capital at Persepolis. Rising from the plain of Fars like a vision of divine kingship made manifest in stone, Persepolis embodied everything that the Achaemenid Empire had become: a synthesis of cultures, a celebration of diversity within unity, a testament to the possibility of governing vast territories through wisdom rather than force alone. The great staircases carved with representatives of all the empire's peoples bearing tribute spoke not of subjugation, but of participation in a grand collective enterprise. This was the empire that would face the ultimate test of its strength and resilience, when a young Macedonian king named Alexander crossed the Hellespont, with dreams of conquest that matched even those of Cyrus himself. The Persia that Alexander would encounter was not the decadent, weakened realm of later historical imagination, but a sophisticated civilization at the height of its power. A testament to the enduring vision of the nomadic tribesmen who had dared to dream of ruling the world. Cyrus's vision would bloom into something far grander than even the great king himself might have envisioned, expanding across vast distances until it embraced nearly half the known world. The Achaemenid realm stretched like a golden thread through the fabric of ancient civilization, connecting distant peoples and cultures in ways that had never been accomplished before. From the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush to the azure waters of the Mediterranean, from the scorching deserts of Arabia to the fertile valleys of the Caucasus, this was an empire that defied the very concept of borders. In the east, Persian dominion extended beyond the mighty Indus River, where the morning sun first kissed the empire's frontiers. Here, in what would later be called Gandhara, ancient cities thrived under Persian rule. Their marketplaces filled with the exotic scents of cardamom and cinnamon, their streets echoing with languages from across the known world. The satrap's palace overlooked terraced gardens where peacocks strutted among flowering almond trees, while merchants from distant Babylon bargained with local craftsmen over intricately carved ivory and precious stones that caught the light like captured stars. The very air seemed to shimmer with possibility, as caravans laden with silk and spices prepared for the long journey westward along roads that Persian engineers had carved through mountain passes and across river valleys. Moving westward through the empire, the landscape transformed like pages turning in an ancient tome. The harsh beauty of the Iranian plateau spread endlessly beneath vast skies, where nomadic horsemen had once roamed freely before becoming part of the Persian tapestry. Persepolis rose from this plateau like a dream made manifest in stone, its columns reaching toward heaven, while reliefs depicted the endless procession of tribute-bearers from every corner of the empire. The capital hummed with activity as administrators from distant provinces arrived to pay homage to the King of Kings, their robes reflecting the diverse traditions of their homelands: Egyptian linen, Scythian furs, Indian cottons, dyed in colors that had no names in Persian. The heartland provinces pulsed with the rhythm of imperial administration, where royal roads connected fortress cities and way stations in an intricate network of communication and control. Mounted messengers thundered along these highways, carrying sealed dispatches that bore the weight of imperial commands to governors who ruled territories larger than entire kingdoms of old. The roads themselves were marvels of engineering, cutting straight lines across seemingly impossible terrain, bridging rivers and boring through mountainsides, with a determination that spoke to the Persian genius for organization and their almost mystical belief in the righteousness of their universal rule. In Mesopotamia, the ancient cities of Babylon and Susa experienced a renaissance under Persian governance that surpassed even their legendary past. Babylon's Hanging Gardens, one of the wonders of the world, flourished under Persian patronage, their terraced splendor fed by ingenious irrigation systems that drew water from the distant Euphrates. The ziggurats cast long shadows across neighborhoods where Persian nobles lived alongside Chaldean priests and Jewish exiles, all contributing to a cosmopolitan atmosphere that celebrated diversity within unity. Susa, meanwhile, served as one of the empire's administrative capitals. Its vast palace complexes, adorned with glazed brick reliefs depicting lions and griffins in brilliant blues and golds that seemed to glow with inner fire. The western reaches of the empire encompassed the ancient civilizations of Anatolia, where Greek cities along the coast had been absorbed into the Persian realm with surprising ease. Sardis, the former capital of Lydia, became a crucial satrapal seat where the royal road began its epic journey eastward toward the heart of the empire. The city's markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the Persian world: amber from the Baltic shores, silk from distant Serica, ivory from the African provinces, and precious metals that miners extracted from mountain ranges whose peaks touched the clouds. Local artisans worked these raw materials into objects of breathtaking beauty, creating jewelry and decorative items that would grace the courts of satraps and the palaces of the great king himself. Egypt represented perhaps the most extraordinary jewel in the Persian crown, a land whose ancient civilization stretched back thousands of years before Cyrus was even born. The Nile's annual flood continued its eternal cycle, nurturing crops that fed not only the Egyptian people, but contributed to the granaries that sustained Persian armies on their distant campaigns. Memphis and Thebes maintained their roles as centers of learning and religion, while Alexandria, not yet founded but anticipated in the great port cities along the delta, would someday represent the fusion of Persian administrative genius with Egyptian cultural sophistication. Hieroglyphic inscriptions praised Persian kings as legitimate pharaohs, inheritors of divine authority that stretched back to the dawn of Egyptian civilization. The empire's northern frontiers pressed against the vast steppes where Scythian horsemen roamed, Their mounted archery skills, legendary even among the Persians, who prized horsemanship above almost all other military arts. These borderlands existed in constant tension between settlement and nomadism, between the Persian desire for order and the Scythian love of freedom. Trading posts and fortified settlements marked the empire's reach into these contested territories, while diplomatic marriages and tribute arrangements bound Scythian chieftains to the Persian cause with threads of gold and promises of mutual protection. From the luxury of Persian court life to the harsh realities of frontier governance, the empire functioned as a vast organism whose various parts worked in harmony despite their incredible diversity. The satrap system allowed local traditions to flourish while ensuring imperial unity, creating a balance between central authority and regional autonomy that would influence governmental systems for millennia to come. Royal inspectors travelled constantly throughout the realm, their eyes and ears serving the great king as they monitored the health of provinces that might be months of travel from the imperial centre. The wealth that flowed toward Persepolis and the other royal capitals staggered the imagination of contemporary observers and continues to amaze modern historians. Annual tribute from the satrapies arrived in endless processions: gold from Lydia, silver from the Spanish mines, precious stones from India, rare woods from the Caucasus, fine textiles from every corner of the empire. This treasure supported not only the lavish lifestyle of the Persian court, but funded the infrastructure projects that held the empire together and the military forces that defended its vast perimeter against external threats and internal rebellion. Persian cultural influence permeated every aspect of life within the empire's borders. Yet this influence flowed both ways in a remarkable synthesis of traditions. Persian architectural styles incorporated elements from conquered territories. Persian cuisine adopted flavors and techniques from subject peoples. Persian art reflected the artistic traditions of dozens of different cultures. The result was a civilization that was distinctly Persian, yet somehow universal, rooted in the traditions of the Iranian plateau, yet open to influences from across the known world. Standing at the apex of this vast realm, the great king commanded resources and territories that no single ruler had ever controlled before. From his palace in Persepolis, his word could set armies marching toward distant frontiers, redirect the flow of trade goods across continents, or reshape the religious practices of entire peoples. This was power on a scale that seemed almost divine to contemporary observers, a dominion so vast and complex that it required new forms of administration and new concepts of kingship to manage effectively. Yet, even as the empire reached its territorial zenith, subtle changes were already stirring along its western borders, where Greek city-states were beginning to question Persian supremacy and dream of liberation from imperial control. While the Persian Empire stretched its golden threads across continents, binding together the ancient world's most diverse peoples under one celestial canopy of rule, far to the west in the mountainous kingdom of Macedon, another story was quietly unfolding. The marble corridors of Pella, Macedonia's royal capital, echoed with footsteps that would one day shake the very foundations of Darius's realm, though none yet suspected that destiny was taking shape in the form of a fair-haired boy whose eyes already burned with an intensity that seemed to pierce through time itself. Alexander was born into a world where ambition flowed like wine at symposiums, where the scent of olive groves mingled with the metallic tang of bronze weapons being forged in preparation for the next campaign. His father, Philip II, had already begun the transformation of Macedonia from a peripheral kingdom into a military powerhouse, but it was in his son that the true fire of conquest would find its vessel. The palace at Pella, with its intricate mosaics depicting Dionysus riding his panther and hunters pursuing lions, became the backdrop for a childhood unlike any other in the ancient world. From his earliest years, Alexander moved through spaces filled with the soft murmur of courtiers speaking in hushed tones about distant lands and legendary heroes. The walls around him were adorned with frescoes that told stories of gods and mortals, of Perseus slaying Medusa, of Achilles dragging Hector's body around the walls of Troy. These images seeped into his consciousness like morning light filtering through silk curtains. creating within his young mind a landscape where myth and reality blended into one shimmering vision of what mortal men might achieve when touched by divine favor. His mother, Olympias of Epirus, moved through the palace like a figure from those very myths, her presence commanding and mysterious. She spoke to him of bloodlines that stretched back to Achilles himself, of divine connections that marked their family as chosen by the gods. Her voice carried the cadence of ancient prayers, and when she told him stories of his ancestors, the torchlight would dance across her face, transforming her features into something that seemed to belong more to legend than to the everyday world of palace politics and diplomatic negotiations. The education that would shape this remarkable child began when he was still young enough to believe that all the world's mysteries could be unraveled through the patient accumulation of knowledge. Philip, recognizing that his heir would need more than martial prowess to fulfill his destiny, sought out the greatest mind of the age to serve as tutor. The man who would arrive at Pella carried with him the accumulated wisdom of Athens, where philosophy had reached heights that made even the gods seem subject to logical inquiry. Aristotle came to Macedonia bearing the intellectual legacy of Plato's Academy, his mind a repository of investigations into every aspect of existence, from the movement of celestial bodies to the nature of friendship. When he established his school in the gardens of Mieza, a sacred grove dedicated to the nymphs, he created a sanctuary where young Alexander could explore ideas that would later reshape the ancient world's understanding of kingship, culture, and the very meaning of civilization itself. The philosopher's arrival transformed the rhythms of Alexander's days. Where once there had been only the practical lessons of horsemanship and weapon training, now there were hours spent beneath the spreading branches of ancient trees, engaged in conversations that ranged from the classification of animals to the proper governance of cities. Aristotle's voice, measured and precise, guided his pupil through labyrinths of thought that were no less challenging than the physical mazes that decorated the palace floors. Under this tutelage, Alexander's mind became a carefully tended garden, where seeds of diverse knowledge took root and flourished. He learned that the world extended far beyond the boundaries of any single empire, that there were peoples and customs and ways of thinking that differed vastly from those he had known in Macedon. The philosopher spoke of distant India, where wise men contemplated the nature of existence, of Egypt, where priests preserved knowledge in hieroglyphs more ancient than memory, of Persia itself, that vast realm where fire burned eternally in sacred temples and kings ruled by divine mandate. The lessons extended beyond formal instruction, weaving themselves into the fabric of daily life at Mieza. Alexander walked among olive groves while discussing the nature of courage, sat beside streams while learning about the properties of water and its role in shaping the Earth's surface. The natural world became his laboratory. Each flower and stone and passing cloud an opportunity to understand the principles that governed all existence. His tutor encouraged him to observe closely, to question assumptions, to seek the underlying patterns that connected seemingly disparate phenomena. Perhaps most significantly, Aristotle introduced his pupil to the poetry of Homer, those ancient verses that had already shaped Greek consciousness for centuries. The Iliad became more than entertainment. It was a handbook of heroic conduct, a meditation on honor and mortality, a guide to the complex relationships between gods and mortals. Alexander memorized long passages, carrying them with him like talismans, until the rhythm of Homeric verse became the rhythm of his own thoughts. The hero Achilles, that paragon of martial excellence and tragic fate, emerged as both inspiration and warning, a figure whose glory came at the ultimate price. The education encompassed not merely intellectual pursuits, but the cultivation of character itself. Aristotle spoke of the golden mean, that perfect balance between extremes that marked the truly virtuous man. He taught that courage lay not in the absence of fear, but in right action, despite fear, that justice required not merely the application of law, but the wisdom to discern what each situation demanded. These lessons took root in fertile soil, for Alexander possessed both the intellectual capacity to understand such concepts and the emotional intensity to be moved by them. As seasons cycled through the grove at Mieza, the young prince's education deepened and broadened. He studied the art of rhetoric, learning to shape words as precisely as any craftsman shaped metal or stone. He explored mathematics, discovering the elegant relationships that governed both earthly architecture and celestial movements. Natural philosophy revealed to him the hidden workings of the physical world, from the smallest insects to the largest rivers, all following laws that could be discovered through careful observation and logical reasoning. The political dimensions of his education proved equally transformative. Aristotle had written extensively about the ideal state, about the various forms of government and their strengths and weaknesses. He shared these insights with Alexander, discussing how different peoples might be governed according to their particular natures and circumstances. These conversations planted seeds that would later bloom into Alexander's revolutionary approach to ruling diverse populations, his willingness to adapt and synthesize rather than simply impose Macedonian customs upon conquered peoples. Throughout this period of intensive learning, Alexander remained connected to the broader world through regular correspondence and visits from his father's court. News arrived regularly of Philip's campaigns, of territorial gains and diplomatic achievements, of the steady expansion of Macedonian influence throughout the Greek world. These reports served as reminders that education was not an end in itself, but preparation for the practical business of ruling and conquest. The relationship between student and teacher evolved into something approaching friendship, though always tempered by mutual respect for their different roles and perspectives. Aristotle recognized in his pupil a mind capable of grasping complex ideas with remarkable speed, while Alexander came to appreciate the depth and breadth of his tutor's knowledge. Their discussions continued long after formal lessons had ended, extending into evening hours when torchlight flickered across the garden paths and the sounds of the wider world seemed distant and dreamlike. By the time this extraordinary education drew to its close, Alexander had been transformed from a precocious child into a young man whose intellectual horizons stretched as far as his political ambitions. He had learned to see patterns and connections across vast expanses of knowledge, to synthesize ideas from different traditions, to think both practically and philosophically about the challenges that lay ahead. The seeds of greatness, already present in his character, had been nurtured by one of history's finest minds, until they were ready to burst forth and reshape the ancient world in ways that neither student nor teacher could have fully anticipated. The education beneath Aristotle's patient guidance had forged Alexander into something far more complex than a mere warrior prince. Philosophy and warfare danced together in his mind like twin flames, illuminating pathways that would soon reshape the ancient world. Yet, even as the young Macedonian absorbed the wisdom of Athens through his tutor's measured words, the great currents of history were already shifting around him, drawing the civilizations of East and West toward an inevitable collision. Across the Aegean Sea, the wounds of old conflicts festered like untreated sores. The Persian Wars, though distant now by more than a century, had left scars that ran deeper than the visible ruins scattered across Greek city-states. In the collective memory of Hellenic civilization, the names Thermopylae and Marathon echoed not merely as battles won or lost, but as sacred touchstones of identity itself. The Greeks had defined themselves in opposition to the vast empire that stretched beyond the horizon, that sprawling realm where the great king ruled from his golden throne in Persepolis. The Achaemenid Empire, for its part, had never truly forgotten the sting of those early defeats. Darius and Xerxes had tasted the bitter salt of retreat, watching their seemingly infinite armies founder against Greek shields and Greek resolve. The empire's pride, built upon centuries of inexorable expansion, bore the memory of those Greek victories like a constant, throbbing reminder of limitation. In the halls of Persepolis, where carved reliefs depicted endless processions of tribute-bearers from across the known world, the absence of Hellenic submission remained a glaring omission. Between these two civilizations lay the Greek cities of Asia Minor, suspended like precious stones in a setting of perpetual tension. Miletus, Ephesus, Halicarnassus. These ancient settlements found themselves caught between competing visions of the world. Their Greek heritage pulled them westward toward the democratic ideals and cultural flowering of Athens. Yet their geographic reality bound them to the Persian administrative system that had governed them for generations. The satraps who ruled these territories walked a delicate balance, maintaining order while navigating the competing loyalties of their subjects. The gold of Persia flowed like a great river through these borderlands, funding revolts and counter-revolts, supporting exiles and pretenders in an endless game of political chess. Persian diplomacy operated on a scale that dwarfed Greek experience, wielding wealth as deftly as any weapon. The empire's agents moved through the Hellenic world like shadows, their purses heavy with darics, the golden coins that bore the image of the archer king. This treasure bought not just mercenaries and ships, but something far more valuable: division among the Greeks themselves. For Macedonia, positioned on the northern edge of the Greek world, these tensions created both opportunity and peril. Philip II had inherited a kingdom that existed in the shadow of both Greek sophistication and Persian might. His genius lay in recognizing that Macedonia's strength could only be built by wedding Greek military innovation to his own people's raw courage and discipline. The phalanx formations that he perfected represented more than tactical evolution. They embodied a new vision of warfare that could challenge even the legendary Persian host. As Philip's power grew, so too did his ambitions. The sacred wars that racked central Greece provided the perfect pretext for Macedonian intervention. Each victory brought new territories under his control, new resources to fund his expanding military machine. The other Greek states watched with growing alarm as this northern kingdom, long dismissed as semi-barbarous, began to overshadow the traditional powers. Athens and Thebes found themselves forced into the unfamiliar position of reacting to Macedonian initiative rather than setting the terms of engagement themselves. The Persian court in Susa observed these developments with the calculating gaze of an empire that had survived for 2 centuries by understanding the ebb and flow of regional politics. Reports arrived from Anatolia describing Philip's growing influence, his diplomatic overtures to the Greek cities under Persian rule. The great king Artaxerxes III, called Ochus for his fierce temperament, recognized the potential threat that Macedonian expansion represented. Yet, the empire faced challenges on multiple fronts: rebellion in Egypt, unrest in the eastern satrapies, the constant pressure of maintaining control over vast distances. Philip's marriage diplomacy added another layer to these complex relationships. Each of his 7 wives brought not merely personal alliance, but entire networks of obligation and opportunity. When he wed Odoata, an Illyrian princess, the marriage secured his northern frontiers. His union with Olympias of Epirus bound him to one of the most ancient royal lines in Greece, carrying with it claims to divine descent and mystical authority. These matrimonial bonds created a web of connections that extended Macedonian influence far beyond the kingdom's geographic boundaries. The young Alexander absorbed these lessons in realpolitik alongside his philosophical education. While Aristotle instructed him in the nature of virtue and the proper ordering of states, the practical reality of his father's court demonstrated how power actually flowed in the ancient world. The prince learned to read the subtle signs of diplomatic communication, understanding how a gift of horses might convey friendship while the placement of an embassy could signal threat. In the Persian satrapal courts of Western Asia Minor, Greek exiles plotted their return to power, sustained by imperial gold and imperial patience. These men spoke eloquently of liberation and justice, yet their words carried the weight of foreign backing. The satrap Artabazus had sheltered both Athenian democrats and Theban oligarchs at various times, playing the complex game of keeping Greek divisions alive while maintaining Persian interests. The assassination that would change everything began to take shape in the shadowed corners of the Macedonian court itself. Philip's final marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian noblewoman, sent shockwaves through the established order. This union represented more than personal choice. It challenged the position of Olympias and, by extension, Alexander's place in the succession. The wedding feast that celebrated this new alliance also witnessed the first sparks of the conflagration that would soon consume the ancient world. Olympias, descended from the royal house of Epirus and initiate of the Orphic mysteries, possessed both the fury of a scorned woman and the calculating intelligence of a born politician. Her response to Philip's new marriage would prove to be far more than mere personal revenge. In the sacred grove of Aegae, where Macedonian kings had been crowned for generations, the threads of conspiracy began to weave together. The catalyst approached like a slow-gathering storm, visible to those who knew how to read the signs. Persian gold continued to flow westward, seeking any crack in Macedonian unity that might be widened. Greek orators in Athens thundered against Philip's growing power, their words carried by swift ships to every corner of the Hellenic world. In the Persian capital, the aging Artaxerxes watched and waited, perhaps sensing that the great game between East and West was approaching its next decisive phase. The young prince, who would soon inherit this explosive legacy, continued his studies, unaware that his father's life hung by threads as fine as spider's silk. Alexander's education in philosophy and statecraft was nearing its completion, yet the greatest lessons still awaited him in the harsh school of actual rule. The collision between Greek ambition and Persian power, between Macedonian energy and Achaemenid tradition, gathered momentum like an avalanche on a mountainside, inevitable, devastating, and utterly transformative of everything it would touch. The spring of 334 BCE dawned over the narrow waters of the Hellespont, where Europe and Asia meet in an eternal embrace of opposing shores. Here, where the ancient world held its breath between continents, a young king named Alexander stood at the helm of destiny. The assassination of his father, Philip II, had thrust him into a role that seemed impossibly vast for his 22 years. Yet the fire that burned within his eyes spoke of ambitions that stretched far beyond the horizon. The Persian Empire, that vast tapestry of nations and peoples that had dominated the Eastern world for 2 centuries, awaited across the wine-dark waters like a sleeping giant, unaware that its greatest trial was about to begin. The crossing itself carried profound symbolism that resonated through the bones of every soldier who witnessed it. Alexander had chosen to make this journey not merely as a military commander, but as a pilgrim to the ancient world, stepping into the footsteps of heroes whose names had echoed through the halls of memory since time immemorial. As his ship cut through the choppy waters of the strait, the young king performed rituals that connected him to the legendary past, pouring libations into the wine-dark sea and invoking the spirits of those who had fought and died in these sacred waters centuries before. The very act of crossing transformed a simple military maneuver into something approaching the mythical, as if the gods themselves had orchestrated this moment when East would meet West in a clash that would reshape the known world. The Macedonian army that followed Alexander across those ancient waters represented the culmination of military innovation and tactical genius. 35,000 men strong, they moved with the precision of a vast machine crafted for war. Yet within their ranks beat the hearts of farmers and shepherds, blacksmiths and merchants, all bound together by loyalty to their young king and dreams of glory that lay beyond the eastern horizon. The phalanx formations bristled with 18-foot sarissas, those devastating pikes that had revolutionized warfare under Philip II, while the companion cavalry rode with the fluid grace of centaurs, their bronze armor gleaming like liquid fire in the Mediterranean sun. Each soldier carried not just weapons and provisions, but the weight of expectation that stretched back through generations of Macedonian tradition and forward into an uncertain future where anything seemed possible. The Persian response to this invasion revealed the complex nature of an empire that had grown too vast for its own swift reaction. Darius III, the great king who ruled from his distant palace in Persepolis, could not have imagined that this Macedonian prince represented anything more than another barbarian raid that could be easily contained and repelled. The satrapies of Western Asia Minor, those provincial kingdoms that formed the empire's first line of defense, moved with the ponderous certainty of administrators who had grown comfortable in their authority. They summoned armies from across the region, calling upon the diverse peoples who served under the Persian banner, from the hardy mountain tribes of Cappadocia to the skilled horsemen of Phrygia, each contingent bringing its own traditions of warfare and its own understanding of honor and duty. As Alexander's forces established their first foothold on Asian soil, the very landscape seemed to whisper of the momentous changes that were about to unfold. The rolling hills and fertile valleys of the Troad, that legendary region where Troy had once stood in all its golden glory, now witnessed the arrival of a new generation of warriors whose deeds would eclipse even those immortalized by Homer. The ancient ruins scattered across the countryside served as silent witnesses to the rise and fall of civilizations, their weathered stones holding secrets of forgotten battles and vanished kingdoms. In the distance, the snow-capped peaks of Asia Minor caught the morning light like jeweled crowns, promising riches and adventures beyond imagination for those bold enough to claim them. The Persian army that gathered to meet this Macedonian threat represented the multinational character of the Achaemenid Empire in all its diverse splendor. 20,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry assembled under the command of the regional satraps, their ranks filled with warriors from every corner of the western provinces. Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary in Persian service, brought his hard-earned expertise in warfare against fellow Greeks, while the Persian nobles commanded contingents of their own countrymen with the casual authority of those born to rule. The diversity of languages, customs, and fighting styles within their camp reflected the empire's greatest strength, and perhaps its most vulnerable weakness, as unity of command often struggled against the proud independence of so many different peoples. The Granicus River wound its way through the Phrygian countryside like a silver serpent, its banks lined with reeds and willows that rustled in the gentle breeze. Here, where the water ran clear over smooth stones and fish darted through the shadows of overhanging branches, destiny had chosen to stage its next great drama. The Persian commanders, confident in their superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the terrain, positioned their forces along the eastern bank with the careful precision of experienced generals. Their cavalry stretched in a glittering line across the rising ground beyond the river, while their infantry formations provided solid support in the rear, their shields and spears creating a forest of bronze and steel that seemed impenetrable to any force bold enough to challenge it. The morning of battle dawned with a clarity that seemed to sharpen every detail of the unfolding drama. Alexander rode along his lines, mounted on Bucephalus, that legendary stallion whose black coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the early light. The young king's presence electrified his troops with an energy that seemed almost supernatural, as if the very air around him crackled with the promise of victory and glory. His voice carried clearly across the ranks as he reminded his soldiers of their training, their brotherhood, and the divine favor that had brought them safely across the sea to this moment of destiny. Behind him, the Macedonian standards snapped in the morning breeze, while the sun climbed slowly toward its zenith, as if the gods themselves were taking time to witness what was about to unfold. The charge began with the thunderous sound of thousands of hooves striking the earth in unison, a rhythm that seemed to echo the very heartbeat of the world itself. Alexander led from the front with the companion cavalry, their formation tight as a spearhead as they plunged down the slope toward the river. The water exploded in sheets of silver spray as the horses entered the stream, their riders leaning forward with weapons ready and hearts pounding with the fierce joy of battle. On the opposite bank, the Persian cavalry surged forward to meet them, and in that moment when the two forces collided, the very air seemed to ring with the clash of bronze on bronze, the screaming of horses, and the war cries of men who knew that history itself hung in the balance of their courage. The battle raged with a fury that transformed the peaceful riverbank into a scene from the most violent dreams of war. Alexander found himself surrounded by Persian nobles who recognized his royal insignia and sought to win immortal glory by striking down the Macedonian king. His helmet took blow after crushing blow, while Clytus the Black, one of his most trusted bodyguards, fought desperately to keep the young king alive in the swirling chaos of combat. Blood mixed with river water as men and horses fell, their cries echoing across the countryside, while vultures gathered in the sky above. Drawn by the ancient promise of battlefield feast, that had called to them since warfare first came to the world of mortals. Victory came with the sudden collapse of Persian resistance as their line finally broke under the relentless pressure of Macedonian discipline and courage. The surviving Persian cavalry scattered across the countryside like leaves before an autumn storm, while their infantry, seeing the battle lost, began their own retreat toward the safety of the eastern hills. Alexander stood victorious on the blood-soaked ground beside the Granicus, his armor dented and his face streaked with the dust and sweat of combat. Yet his eyes already looking beyond this triumph toward the greater challenges that awaited deeper in the heart of the Persian Empire. The first step had been taken on a journey that would carry him to the edges of the known world and beyond, into realms of legend and myth, where only the greatest of heroes dared to tread. The dust of Granicus had barely settled, when Alexander's gaze turned eastward, deeper into the heart of the Persian realm, where shadows of an ancient empire stretched across vast landscapes of gold and amber. The victory at the river crossing had been swift, almost deceptively simple, yet it marked only the first tentative steps into a world that had existed in splendor and power for over 2 centuries. Beyond the coastal cities of Asia Minor lay territories that had known the footsteps of Cyrus the Great, lands where the morning sun first touched the marble columns of Persepolis, and where the dreams of Darius the Great had once shaped the destiny of nations. As the Macedonian army moved inland, the very air seemed to change, carrying with it the scent of frankincense and myrrh from distant trading routes, the whisper of silk banners that had fluttered in the courts of Susa and Babylon. The soldiers, their bronze armor gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, found themselves marching through landscapes that spoke of civilizations far older than their own mountain kingdom. Here were cities that had flourished when Athens was still a collection of villages, roads that had carried the messages of kings across distances that boggled the mind, and architectural wonders that seemed to rise from the earth itself, like dreams made manifest in stone and precious metals. The news of Alexander's crossing and his victory at Granicus rippled across the Persian Empire like stones dropped into still water, each successive wave carrying greater urgency as it reached the ears of governors, satraps, and finally the great king himself. In the palace chambers of Babylon, where ivory-inlaid walls depicted the glory of past conquests, Darius III Gaugamela received reports that must have seemed almost impossible to comprehend. This young Macedonian prince, this student of Aristotle who commanded barely 30,000 men, had dared to set foot on sacred Persian soil, and had driven back the forces of the empire that stretched from the Indus to the Nile, from the Caucasus Mountains to the burning sands of Arabia. Darius III was not the weak ruler that later historians would sometimes portray, but rather a man caught in the inexorable currents of historical change. A king whose personal courage would soon be tested against forces that no amount of royal blood or inherited wisdom could fully prepare him to face. The Persian Empire he ruled was like a magnificent tapestry woven from countless threads. Babylonian astronomers and Egyptian priests, Phoenician merchants and Scythian horsemen, Indian mathematicians, and Arabian incense traders. Each province contributed its unique strengths to an imperial structure that had endured through the reigns of 27 kings. Yet this very diversity, which had once been the empire's greatest strength, now posed challenges that required not just administrative skill, but military genius of the highest order. The Persian response began to coalesce in the fertile plains of northern Syria, where the ancient city of Damascus stood sentinel over trade routes that had carried wealth and wisdom between east and west since time immemorial. Here, in a landscape dotted with olive groves and watered by streams that sang their way down from the Lebanese mountains, Darius gathered an army that reflected the true diversity of his empire. From the eastern satrapies came contingents of horse archers whose ancestors had learned their deadly skills on the steppes beyond the Oxus River. Persian immortals marched in formation, their golden spear butts catching the light, while Greek mercenaries, men who fought for coin rather than homeland, provided the disciplined infantry that Persian nobles had learned to respect, if not entirely trust. The clash that would reshape the ancient world came at Issus, where the narrow coastal plain between the Mediterranean Sea and the towering Amanus Mountains created a natural amphitheatre for one of history's most decisive encounters. The location itself seemed chosen by fate, a place where the ancient world would pivot on its axis, where the aspirations of Macedonia would meet the accumulated power of centuries of Persian rule. The beaches where Phoenician galleys had once loaded purple dye and cedar wood now witnessed the deployment of armies whose very presence would echo through the corridors of time. Alexander arrived first, his forces moving with the coordinated precision that had become their hallmark, the cavalry taking positions on the flanks while the sarissa-bearing phalanx formed its deadly hedgehog in the center. The morning mist rising from the sea seemed to part before the Macedonian advance, as if nature itself recognized the momentous character of what was about to unfold. Behind them stretched a supply train that included not just weapons and provisions, but also scholars and artists, engineers and philosophers. For Alexander's campaign was as much about the conquest of knowledge as of territory. When Darius appeared with his vast host, the very ground seemed to tremble under the weight of his army's passage. The great king rode in a war chariot that was itself a work of art, its sides decorated with scenes of Persian triumph, its golden fittings reflecting the morning sun like captured fire. Around him flowed contingents from every corner of his empire: Bactrian cavalry with their distinctive pointed caps, Median spearmen whose ancestors had helped Cyrus conquer Babylon, Egyptian infantry who carried shields emblazoned with hieroglyphs that told stories of pharaohs and gods. The sight must have been overwhelming in its scope and splendor. A river of humanity, representing dozens of nations and cultures, all united under the banner of the King of Kings. The battle itself unfolded with a terrible inevitability, as if the movements of armies across the narrow plain were following some cosmic choreography written in the stars themselves. The Persian numbers, which should have been their greatest advantage, became a hindrance in the confined space between mountains and sea. The famous immortals, resplendent in their scale armor and carrying shields that bore the image of the winged sun disk of Ahura Mazda, found themselves pressed together so tightly that their individual skill counted for less than the collective momentum of the Macedonian phalanx. The air filled with the clash of bronze against iron, the splintering of wooden shield rims, and the cries of men in dozens of languages as the fate of empires was decided in a space no larger than a few wheat fields. Alexander himself fought like one possessed by divine fury, his presence on the battlefield serving as both inspiration to his own men and a lodestone that drew the attention of every Persian archer and spearman within range. His horse, Bucephalus, seemed to understand the weight of the moment, carrying his master through gaps in enemy lines that opened and closed like waves breaking against a rocky shore. The young king's armor, crafted by the finest metalworkers of Macedonia, bore new dents and scratches with each passing moment, each mark a testament to his willingness to share the dangers faced by the humblest foot soldier in his ranks. But it was in the moment when the Persian center began to waver that the true tragedy of Issus revealed itself. Darius III, that man who had inherited an empire that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction, found himself facing a choice that no amount of royal training could have prepared him for. The battle was not yet lost. Persian contingents on the flanks still fought with desperate courage, and reinforcements might still arrive from the vast reserves that the empire could theoretically deploy. Yet something in the momentum of the moment, some quality in the air itself, suggested that this was more than just another military engagement to be won or lost according to the familiar calculus of warfare. The flight of Darius from the field at Issus became one of those moments that history remembers with peculiar clarity. Not because it was shameful, for personal courage was never in question, but because it symbolized something far larger than the fate of one man or even one battle. When the great king's chariot wheeled away from the fighting, carrying him toward the safety of the mountains that rose like ancient guardians against the eastern sky, it marked not just a tactical withdrawal, but the beginning of the end for an empire that had seemed as permanent as the stars themselves. Behind him, in the royal pavilion that had been prepared with all the luxury befitting the ruler of the known world, remained his family, his wife, his daughters, his aged mother, captives now in a conflict that had suddenly transformed from a local rebellion into something approaching the reshaping of civilization itself. The Persian camp, when Alexander's soldiers finally reached it in the gathering dusk, revealed treasures that seemed to belong more to legend than to the practical business of warfare. Golden vessels that had been crafted in the workshops of Babylon, silk tapestries that had been woven in distant Sogdiana, and precious stones that had been mined in the hills beyond Bactria, where few Greeks had ever ventured. The echoes of Issus had barely faded when Alexander turned his gaze southward, where the ancient cities of the Levant awaited like jewels strung along the Mediterranean coast. The young Macedonian king understood that control of the sea required mastery of the ports, and among these maritime strongholds, none commanded more respect or inspired greater dread than the island fortress of Tyre. This legendary city, perched upon its rocky outcrop half a mile from the mainland, had withstood sieges for centuries, its massive walls rising directly from the churning waters like the ramparts of some divine citadel. The Tyrians watched Alexander's approach with a mixture of defiance and confidence, born from generations of successful resistance. Their city had been built by the Phoenicians as the ultimate maritime fortress, connected to the mainland only by the narrow causeway that Alexander's engineers would soon transform into something far more substantial. The purple-dyed sails of Tyrian ships dotted the harbour, while merchants from across the known world continued their ancient trade in the shadow of the approaching storm. Within the city's walls, the great temple of Melkart stood as both spiritual centre and symbol of Tyrian independence, its bronze pillars gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. Alexander's initial diplomatic overtures met with polite but firm rejection. The Tyrians offered to honour the Macedonian king, as they had honoured Persian overlords before him, with tribute and nominal submission. But they would not open their gates, nor allow foreign soldiers to sacrifice in their sacred temple. This refusal sparked something deeper than mere tactical frustration in Alexander's mind. The young conqueror had begun to see himself not merely as a military commander, but as a figure of divine destiny, and the Tyrians' resistance felt like a challenge to the very gods themselves. What followed would become one of the most remarkable engineering feats in ancient warfare. Alexander commanded his engineers to construct a massive causeway, a mole of stone and timber that would bridge the gap between mainland and island. Thousands of workers laboured under the scorching Levantine sun, hauling massive stones quarried from the ruins of old Tyre on the mainland, while others felled the great cedars of Lebanon to provide the timber framework. The causeway grew slowly, each day adding precious yards to the structure that would ultimately seal Tyre's fate. The Tyrians responded with desperate innovation. Fire ships laden with combustible materials sailed forth under cover of darkness, their flames dancing across the water like fallen stars as they sought to burn the wooden portions of the growing causeway. Divers slipped beneath the waves to attack the underwater foundations, their bronze knives glinting in the filtered sunlight as they worked to undermine Alexander's grand construction. The city's skilled engineers devised new forms of artillery, hurling not just stones and arrows, but heated sand and molten metal upon the advancing Macedonians. As weeks turned to months, the siege took on the character of a contest between civilizations. The Tyrians represented the ancient maritime tradition of the Phoenicians, masters of trade and navigation who had planted colonies from Spain to North Africa. Their resistance embodied the fierce independence of city-states that had thrived through commerce and cunning rather than conquest. Against them stood Alexander's vision of a unified world under Macedonian hegemony, supported by the engineering prowess of Greek mathematics and the relentless discipline of the phalanx formation. The causeway continued its inexorable advance despite every Tyrian stratagem. Alexander himself could often be seen directing the work, his purple cloak streaming in the sea breeze as he encouraged his men through the grinding labour. The structure began to take on mythical proportions in the minds of both besiegers and besieged, a bridge between past and future that would fundamentally alter the geography of the coastline. Ancient writers would later marvel at how Alexander had transformed an island into a peninsula through sheer force of will and engineering skill. When the causeway finally reached the walls of Tyre, the final assault came with devastating swiftness. Siege towers rolled across the stone bridge like moving fortresses, their bronze-reinforced sides gleaming in the morning sun. Catapults launched a barrage that shattered sections of wall that had stood for centuries, while Alexander's elite troops, the Hypaspists, prepared for the brutal work of storming a breach. The city that had resisted Nebuchadnezzar for 13 years fell to Alexander in 7 months, its proud walls finally yielding to Macedonian determination and Greek engineering. The fall of Tyre sent shockwaves throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus submitted without resistance, its kings sailing to Alexander with golden crowns and pledges of loyalty. The great cities of Sidon and Byblos opened their gates, their merchants calculating that profit lay with the victor rather than in futile resistance. News of the siege reached Egypt, where the Persian satrap Mazasis found his position suddenly precarious, as local populations began to whisper of liberation from Persian rule. Alexander's march southward along the coast became a triumphal procession, punctuated by acts of calculated mercy and strategic brutality. The king had learned the art of psychological warfare, understanding that each surrendered city encouraged others to capitulate, while each destroyed stronghold served as a warning to those who might consider resistance. The ancient trade routes that had carried goods between Egypt and Mesopotamia for millennia now carried tales of the young king who had bridged the impossible waters and brought low the unconquerable city. Gaza alone, among the remaining coastal fortresses, chose to resist. Its commander Battis believing that the desert fortress could succeed where maritime Tyre had failed. The siege that followed proved shorter, but no less brutal than the ordeal at Tyre. Alexander's siege engines, refined by months of combat engineering, breached Gaza's walls with methodical efficiency. The city's fall opened the final approach to Egypt, the land of the pharaohs that had remained under Persian control since Cambyses first crossed the Sinai Desert 2 centuries earlier. The march across the Sinai Desert marked a transition not just in geography, but in the very nature of Alexander's expedition. The harsh beauty of the desert landscape, with its endless dunes and star-filled nights, seemed to work a transformation upon the young king's imagination. Egyptian envoys met the advancing Macedonian column with news that would reshape the ancient world. The Persian garrison in Memphis had withdrawn, and Egypt lay ready to welcome Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator who would restore the ancient ways and honor the traditional gods. As the fertile delta of the Nile came into view, Alexander gazed upon a land that had remained essentially unchanged since the time of the pyramid builders. The great river flowed northward through landscapes that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties stretching back 3 millennia, carrying the promise of harvest and renewal that had made Egypt the granary of the ancient world. Here was a civilization older than Greece, older than Persia, older perhaps than memory itself, waiting to embrace a new chapter in its eternal story. The dust of Egypt still clung to Macedonian cloaks as Alexander's army turned eastward once more, their bronze and iron glinting under the harsh sun of the Syrian desert. Behind them lay the ancient mysteries of Memphis and the oracle's whispered prophecies at Siwa. But ahead stretched the vast expanse of Mesopotamia, that cradle of civilizations where the Tigris and Euphrates carved their eternal paths through lands that had witnessed the rise and fall of kings for 3 millennia. The young conqueror's eyes were fixed upon a prize greater than any city or fortress, the heart of the Persian Empire itself, and with it the throne of Darius III. Autumn's breath had begun to cool the desert nights, when reports reached the Macedonian camp of Darius's movements far to the east. The great king had not remained idle during Alexander's sojourn in Egypt, but had spent those precious months gathering the greatest host the world had ever seen. From the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush came the fierce Bactrian cavalry, their horses bred for endurance and speed across endless steppes. The warriors of Sogdiana arrived with their curved bows and arrows that could pierce armor at impossible distances. From distant Scythia, beyond the great river, came nomad horsemen who knew no fear of death, while the Armenian highlands sent their mountain fighters, and the fertile valleys of Hyrcania contributed their legendary cavalry formations. The Persian war machine had awakened fully, its full might summoned for what all knew would be the final confrontation. Persian engineers labored day and night to construct war chariots fitted with scythe blades that gleamed like silver death in the Mesopotamian sun, designed to cut through phalanx formations like farmers' tools through wheat. 15 war elephants had been brought from distant India, their tusks capped with iron points, their thick hides painted with protective symbols that had blessed warriors since time immemorial. Behind these exotic terrors marched the immortals, 10,000 strong as always, their golden spears catching the light as they moved in perfect unison across the plains. Darius had chosen his ground with the careful calculation of a king who understood that this battle would determine not merely the fate of his empire, but the very course of history itself. Near the ancient village of Gaugamela, in the shadow of ruins that had watched empires rise and crumble into dust, stretched a vast plain perfect for the deployment of cavalry and the terrible scythed chariots. Persian engineers worked through the blazing summer months to level every stone, fill every depression, and create the perfect battlefield where numbers and exotic weapons might finally overwhelm the tactical genius that had carried Alexander through victory after impossible victory. September's heat still shimmered across the prepared ground when Alexander's scouts first glimpsed the Persian encampment, stretching beyond the horizon like a city of silk and bronze. Hundreds of thousands of warriors had gathered under Darius's banners, their campfires at night creating a galaxy of light that rivaled the stars themselves. The polyglot voices of a dozen languages mingled in the evening air as Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Indians, Arabs, and countless other peoples prepared their weapons and whispered prayers to gods whose names had echoed across these ancient lands since the dawn of time. The Macedonian army, though vastly outnumbered, moved with the confidence of veterans who had never known defeat. Alexander's phalanx had been honed to perfection through years of constant warfare, their long sarissas moving as one deadly organism, while the companion cavalry had evolved into the finest shock troops the ancient world had ever produced. Each man knew his place in Alexander's grand design, understood how his individual role contributed to the greater symphony of destruction that their young king conducted with such terrifying precision. On the morning of October 1st, as dawn painted the Mesopotamian sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to prophesy the blood soon to be spilled, both armies arranged themselves for battle across the vast plain. The Persian line stretched for miles, its center anchored by the immortals and the Greek mercenaries who had remained loyal to Persian gold, while the wings extended so far that they seemed to embrace the very horizon itself. The scythe chariots waited in perfect formation before the main battle line, their blade-fitted wheels designed to carve through enemy ranks like instruments of divine wrath. Alexander's response to this overwhelming display of force was characteristically audacious. Rather than attempt to match the Persian line's impossible length, he concentrated his army into a dense formation that could strike with maximum impact at a chosen point. The phalanx formed the unbreakable center, their bronze-tipped sarissas creating a forest of death 18 feet deep, while Alexander himself took position on the right wing with his beloved companions, their Macedonian horses stamping and snorting in anticipation of the charge that would decide the fate of two worlds. The battle opened with the thunderous advance of the scythed chariots, their iron-shod wheels churning the carefully prepared earth as they bore down upon the Macedonian line with the momentum of an avalanche. The sound of their approach filled the air like the roar of some primordial beast. But Alexander's veterans had faced exotic weapons before and knew that courage and discipline could overcome any terror. The phalanx opened carefully coordinated gaps that allowed the chariots to pass harmlessly through, while javelins and arrows brought down horses and drivers alike, turning Darius's secret weapons into monuments to tactical miscalculation. As the failed chariot charge dissolved into chaos, The main battle lines crashed together with a sound like thunder echoing across the Mesopotamian plain. The Persian center, strengthened by Greek mercenaries, who fought with the desperate fury of men defending their honor against former countrymen, held firm against the initial Macedonian assault. Bronze clashed against iron, spears splintered against shields, and the dust kicked up by thousands of fighting men created a choking fog that turned the battlefield into a vision of primordial chaos where only the strongest and most skilled would survive. But Alexander's true masterstroke came not in the center, where armies traditionally decided their fate, but on the wings, where his tactical genius could create the openings that disciplined violence could exploit. As Darius's line extended itself to prevent being outflanked, gaps inevitably appeared in the Persian formation, gaps that Alexander's experienced eye detected with the predatory instinct of a born warrior. Leading his companions in a wedge formation that had become his signature, the young king drove directly toward one of these openings with the concentrated force of an armor-piercing arrow. The Persian left wing, commanded by Bessus, satrap of Bactria, found itself overwhelmed by the intensity and coordination of the Macedonian assault. Alexander's companions struck with the precision of a surgical instrument, their long spears finding gaps in armor while their horses trampled fallen enemies into the blood-soaked earth. Behind them came the hypaspists, Alexander's elite infantry, exploiting the breach with the methodical efficiency of craftsmen perfecting their deadly art across years of constant warfare. The decisive moment came when Alexander's penetration of the Persian line brought him within striking distance of Darius himself. The great king, mounted in his ornate chariot, and surrounded by his personal guard of noble cavalry, found himself faced with the terrible choice that had haunted Persian rulers since Marathon and Plataea: stand and fight against overwhelming odds, or preserve the royal person for future battles that might never come. As Macedonian spears drew ever closer to the golden chariot that had symbolized Persian power for 2 centuries, Darius made the decision that would echo through history and legend for thousands of years to come. The sight of their king turning his chariot away from the advancing Macedonians sent shockwaves through the Persian army that no amount of courage or loyalty could overcome. The psychological effect was instantaneous and devastating. If the great king himself fled the field, what hope remained for ordinary soldiers fighting far from their homes and families? The Persian line began to waver, then crack, then shatter completely, as panic spread like wildfire through ranks that moments before had seemed as solid as the mountains of their homeland. The dust of Gaugamela had barely settled when the young Macedonian king understood that victory in battle was merely the first step in conquering an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Darius III had fled the field as his carefully arranged battle lines crumbled, abandoning his royal chariot and the symbols of his divine kingship to the mercy of Alexander's advancing phalanx. But the Persian Empire was not merely an army to be defeated in a single afternoon. It was a vast organism of cities and satrapies, treasuries and temples, bound together by roads that had carried the commands of kings for 2 centuries. The great king himself remained at large, and as long as he drew breath, the legitimacy of Alexander's conquest remained incomplete. The road from Gaugamela led first to Babylon, that ancient jewel of Mesopotamia, where the very air seemed thick with the weight of millennia. The city's massive walls, built of baked brick and bitumen, rose from the fertile plain like artificial mountains, their surfaces gleaming in the autumn sun. As Alexander's army approached, the Persian satrap Mazias, who had commanded the right wing at Gaugamela, emerged from the gates not with weapons but with the keys to the city. The surrender was complete and dignified, a recognition that the old order had passed away on the plains of Assyria. The Macedonian king entered Babylon not as a conqueror, but as heir to its ancient glories, walking through streets where Nebuchadnezzar had once proclaimed his dominion, and where Daniel had interpreted dreams for foreign kings. The city's priests welcomed him with ceremonies that stretched back to the time of Hammurabi, and in their eyes, Alexander saw reflected not the face of a Greek invader, but the newest in an endless succession of rulers who had claimed the title King of Babylon. The treasures that awaited in Babylon's vaults defied comprehension. Silver talents stacked in endless rows, gold vessels wrought in the workshops of distant provinces, precious stones that caught the torchlight like captured stars. Yet these riches, vast as they were, paled beside the strategic prize the city represented. Babylon commanded the convergence of ancient trade routes, its position on the Euphrates making it a natural administrative center for the eastern satrapies. More importantly, its capture sent ripples of psychological impact throughout the Persian Empire. If Babylon, the winter capital of the great kings, could fall so easily, what fortress could hope to stand against the Macedonian advance? From Babylon, Alexander's pursuit took on the character of a royal progress as much as a military campaign. The king distributed the treasures with calculated generosity, rewarding his Macedonians while simultaneously demonstrating Persian administrative methods to govern his expanding realm. He appointed Persian nobles to positions of authority alongside his own commanders, beginning that delicate process of fusion between conqueror and conquered that would define his reign. Yet always, like a compass needle seeking magnetic north, his attention remained fixed on the fleeing figure of Darius. The great king had withdrawn eastward toward his ancestral heartland of Persis, gathering what remained of his military strength while sending desperate embassies to the eastern satrapies, calling upon their loyalty to the dynasty that had ruled them for generations. The pursuit led through Susa, another of the great Persian capitals, where the administrative machinery of empire hummed with bureaucratic efficiency even as its master fled deeper into Asia. The city's surrender came as smoothly as Babylon's had, its treasury doors opened to reveal wealth that eclipsed even what Alexander had found in Mesopotamia. Here lay the accumulated tribute of decades, the golden ornaments of Lydian craftsmen, Indian ivory carved into fantastic shapes, Egyptian linens so fine they seemed woven from moonbeams. The Persian satrap Abulites handed over not just gold and silver, but the records and tribute lists that revealed the empire's true scope, documents written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian that mapped the flow of wealth from Sogdiana to Cyrenaica. Alexander studied these archives with the attention of a scholar, beginning to understand that ruling Persia required more than military victory. It demanded mastery of systems of governance, refined over centuries. Winter brought the army to the very heart of the Persian world, to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital built by Darius I on a great terrace carved from the living rock of the Zagros Mountains. The city had been designed not merely as a residence, but as a statement. Its massive audience halls and towering columns proclaimed Persian power to embassies from the ends of the earth. The great stairways bore carved reliefs showing tribute bearers from 23 nations ascending to offer their gifts to the King of Kings, each figure rendered with such precision that individual expressions could be read in their stone faces. Persian guards in their fluted caps stood eternally at attention beside Median nobles and Babylonian priests, while above them all rose the winged symbol of Ahura Mazda, the god who had blessed the Achaemenid dynasty. Yet Persepolis, for all its grandeur, could not withstand the Macedonian advance. The city fell without siege or storm, its defenders melting away like snow before the spring sun. Alexander entered the great audience hall, where generations of Persian kings had received the homage of their subjects, his footsteps echoing in chambers that had witnessed the submission of pharaohs and the planning of expeditions to distant India. The treasury here surpassed all previous discoveries, 40,000 talents of silver and gold, accumulated over decades of tribute from the richest provinces of Asia. Persian craftsmen had wrought this wealth into forms of breathtaking beauty. Golden writer shaped like griffins and lions, ceremonial weapons inlaid with precious stones, vessels so delicate they seemed to capture light itself. The destruction of Persepolis came not in the heat of battle, but in the aftermath of a feast, when wine and rhetoric combined to ignite the torches that consumed the palace of Xerxes. The flames that devoured those ancient halls cast dancing shadows on the stone reliefs, creating the illusion that the carved tribute bearers were fleeing the conflagration. Whether the burning was planned revenge for Xerxes' destruction of Athens, or the product of Macedonian excess, mattered less than its symbolic impact. The ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire had been reduced to ash and blackened stone, proclaiming to all who witnessed it that the old order had passed away forever. The smoke that rose from Persepolis carried with it the dreams and pretensions of 2 centuries, dispersing into the mountain air like the ghost of imperial glory. Spring brought renewed pursuit as Darius continued his flight eastward into the Iranian plateau, that vast expanse of desert and mountain that had nurtured the Persian people in their homeland. The great king moved with the desperate energy of a man who understood that his very existence had become the final symbol of resistance to Macedonian rule. Behind him came Alexander, relentless as fate itself, his army moving with the efficiency that only constant campaigning could produce. The Macedonians had learned to march across the varied terrains of Asia, their supply trains adapted to desert and mountain alike, their discipline tempered by victory and hardship in equal measure. The final act of this continental drama played out in the desolate reaches of Hyrcania, where the Caspian Sea meets the Alborz Mountains in a landscape of haunting beauty and terrible isolation. Here, far from the marble palaces of Persepolis and the hanging gardens of Babylon, the last Achaemenid king met his end not in battle with his Macedonian rival, but at the hands of his own subjects. Bessus, satrap of Bactria and kinsman to the royal house, struck down Darius in a final, desperate gambit to salvage Persian independence by sacrificing the king who had lost it. The deed was done beside a dusty road in the pre-dawn darkness, witnessed only by the stars that had looked down on Persian glory since Cyrus first united the Median and Persian tribes. Alexander found the body beside the roadway, the great king reduced to mortality by wounds that no royal physician could heal. The man who had commanded the loyalty of 20 million subjects lay beneath the vast sky of Asia, his elaborate court robes bloodied and torn, his royal regalia scattered in the dust. The Macedonian king gazed down at his fallen rival with what observers described as genuine sorrow, recognizing in Darius not merely an enemy, but a fellow king who had inherited an impossible situation. The last ruler of the house of Cyrus was wrapped in Alexander's own cloak and sent to Persepolis for burial with royal honors, a gesture that proclaimed the young conqueror's transformation from foreign invader to legitimate successor. With Darius's death, the Achaemenid Empire ceased to exist as a political entity, its vast territories becoming provinces in a new order that would stretch from Macedonia to the Indus Valley. Yet the Persian system of administration, the Persian concept of universal kingship, and the Persian dream of uniting diverse peoples under a single crown would live on in Alexander's emerging empire, transformed but recognizable, like a river that changes its course but continues to flow toward the sea. In the vast marble halls of Persepolis, where once the footsteps of Darius and Xerxes had echoed with the authority of divine kingship, a young Macedonian now walked with measured steps that seemed to absorb the very essence of the empire he had conquered. The corridors that had witnessed centuries of Persian ceremony now bore witness to something unprecedented in the annals of ancient history, the transformation of a conqueror into something far more complex and profound than mere victor. Alexander, son of Philip, descendant of Achilles, was becoming something that neither Greece nor Persia had ever seen before. The Persian robes that now adorned his frame were not the simple adoption of foreign dress, but rather the physical manifestation of a deeper metamorphosis taking place within the conqueror's soul. The flowing silk garments, embroidered with golden threads that caught the light streaming through the palace windows, moved with him as he navigated the delicate balance between honoring his Macedonian heritage and embracing the sophisticated administrative wisdom of the Achaemenid system. The weight of the Persian diadem upon his brow carried with it not merely the symbolic power of kingship, but the accumulated wisdom of 2.5 centuries of imperial governance that had stretched from the Indus to the Mediterranean. Within the grand audience chambers, where Cyrus the Great had once received tribute from distant lands, Alexander began to understand that ruling an empire of such vast diversity required more than the tactical brilliance that had won him his victories. The Persian court ceremonies, with their intricate protocols of prostration and divine reverence, initially seemed foreign to the Macedonian sensibility, yet gradually revealed themselves as essential mechanisms for governing peoples who had known no other form of legitimate authority. The act of proskynesis, the ritual prostration before the king that his Greek companions found so distasteful, was not mere Persian arrogance, but rather the cornerstone of an administrative system that had successfully integrated dozens of distinct cultures under a single imperial umbrella. The great libraries of Persepolis and Susa opened their scrolls to the young king, revealing the depth of Persian learning that had been cultivated over generations of enlightened rule. The administrative records, written in the elegant script of Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, told stories of justice dispensed fairly among diverse populations, of religious tolerance that had allowed conquered peoples to maintain their ancient ways, and of economic systems that had created unprecedented prosperity across 3 continents. As Alexander studied these documents by the soft light of oil lamps, the flames casting dancing shadows across the cuneiform inscriptions, he began to comprehend that the true genius of Persian rule lay not in military might alone, but in the art of synthesis, the ability to create unity from diversity without destroying the essential character of the constituent peoples. The transformation became most visible in the way Alexander began to conduct his court. The rigid hierarchies of the Macedonian military camp gradually gave way to the more fluid, ceremonial structures that had governed the Persian Empire for centuries. Persian nobles who had sworn fealty to the new king found themselves not merely tolerated, but actively incorporated into the highest levels of government, their counsel sought on matters of administration and policy. The great satraps who had once served Darius now served Alexander, but more than mere continuity, this represented a fundamental recognition that the expertise required to govern such an empire could not be improvised but must be inherited, absorbed, and respectfully adapted. The marriage to Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian nobleman, marked another crucial step in this transformation. But it was the great wedding ceremony at Susa that truly demonstrated the new imperial vision taking shape in Alexander's mind. 10,000 of his soldiers took Persian wives in a single magnificent celebration, the golden vessels glinting in the torchlight as Greek and Persian customs blended in unprecedented harmony. The ceremony was not merely symbolic but practical, a deliberate attempt to create a new kind of imperial elite that would embody the fusion of 2 great civilizations. The children born of these unions would grow up speaking both Greek and Persian, understanding both the military traditions of Macedonia and the administrative sophistication of the Achaemenids. Yet this transformation came at a cost that grew heavier with each passing season. The Macedonian officers who had followed Alexander across 3 continents began to see their king becoming something alien to their experience, his adoption of Persian dress and customs, creating a distance that military brotherhood could no longer easily bridge. The grumbling in the camps spoke of a commander who had forgotten his roots, who had become intoxicated by Oriental luxury and lost sight of the Hellenic values that had made his conquests possible. These tensions, simmering beneath the surface of continued military success, revealed the fundamental challenge facing any conqueror who sought not merely to rule, but to truly unite disparate civilizations. The great palace complexes that had once symbolized Persian imperial power now became laboratories for a new kind of governance. In the halls where Darius had received ambassadors from distant lands, Alexander experimented with administrative structures that borrowed freely from both Greek and Persian traditions. The appointment of both Macedonian and Persian officials to parallel positions created a system of checks and balances that drew from the democratic traditions of the Greek city-states, while maintaining the centralized efficiency that had made the Persian Empire so enduring. The result was neither purely Greek nor purely Persian, but something entirely new, an imperial system designed to harness the strengths of both civilizations while minimizing their respective weaknesses. As the seasons turned and the empire settled into its new rhythms, the physical transformation of Alexander became increasingly pronounced. The lean warrior who had crossed the Hellespont was giving way to a figure more closely resembling the great kings of Persia, robed in silk, adorned with jewels, surrounded by the ceremonial splendor that Persian subjects expected from their divine ruler. Yet beneath this external transformation lay a deeper change, a growing understanding that true conquest required not the destruction of existing systems, but their careful integration into something larger and more enduring. The evening light, filtering through the latticed windows of the Persian palaces, cast long shadows across floors, where Persian and Macedonian courtiers now mingled as equals, their conversations blending languages and concepts in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The empire that was emerging from this unprecedented experiment in cultural fusion bore the promise of something magnificent, a synthesis that could potentially create a new model for civilized governance, one that respected diversity while maintaining unity, that honored tradition while embracing innovation. In the quiet moments between the ceremonies and councils, when the palace corridors emptied and the sounds of empire faded into whispers, Alexander perhaps contemplated the magnitude of what he had unleashed. The young man who had set out to avenge the Persian invasion of Greece had become something far more complex, the architect of a new kind of world, where the boundaries between conqueror and conquered, between East and West, between Greek and barbarian, were dissolving into something unprecedented in human history. The transformation was complete, yet it was also just beginning, carrying within it the seeds of both magnificent possibility and inevitable tragedy, as all great human endeavors must.